Ich will euch bewegt sehen!
Jetzt geht auch schneller. Und die ganzen Fetten nicht das Gemüse. Einer drauf. Sind hier los? Komm, das kannst du dir Hände an.
What you just saw is a truly horrifying situation. SS members forcing Jewish camp inmates to remove their dead from their graves for cremation. In May 1942, during World War II, the Germans launched a mission called Aktion 1005. This operation was designed with a single purpose: to cover up any evidence that the Nazis had committed genocide against minority groups in the territories they controlled in Eastern Europe. The starting point was Operation Reinhard, which ensured the eradication of Jews in occupied Poland. The next step was the Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile extermination units under the control of the SS and responsible for the massacre of millions of people. Consequently, the Leichenkommandos, a German term for corpse squads, were formed. They were entrusted with the task of exhuming the dead and burning them. The organization was so perverse that the camp inmates themselves had to carry out the exhumation of their fallen. As if that weren't enough, these same workers were liquidated at the end of the task. They were considered tools, in no way different from the human remains they were to extract from the earth. That's why today, in this new installment of military history, we will examine one of the cruelest and most absurd pages of the Second World War. When the Germans tried in vain to conceal one of the most obvious and voluminous crimes in world history, the Holocaust.
Can you believe this?
When the aberrations of the Holocaust began to spread throughout Europe and the world, the Germans set their sights on erasing its memory, and the most barbaric way they could think of was to once again violate the remains of its victims, to obliterate them, as if it were possible to cover up the effects of a genuine genocide. In this sense, from June 1942 until the end of 1944, Adolf Hitler's government adhered to these maneuvers, designed to silence its atrocities. These maneuvers gained greater prominence after the failed German campaign against the Soviet Union, along with the eventual Russian counteroffensive. The rulers of the Third Reich began to assess the likelihood of being defeated in the conflagration, which would force them to admit their atrocities to the rest of the world. The latter seemed completely unacceptable to them. In short, the slave laborers of the detention camps were compelled to erase all traces of the Nazi mass executions. The remains of the deceased were disposed of by the Leichenkommando, corpse units, and they were tied up to prevent them from escaping. Several Nazi task forces shared the role of supervising these tasks, including Sonderkommando 1005, squads of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Security Service, and the Ordnungspolizei, Germany's police force. In March 1942, SS Colonel Paul Blobel was summoned by his superior, Major General Reinhard Heydrich, who delegated him responsibility for the secret mission. Although the transfer was delayed in view of Heydrich's assassination, in June 1942, Blobel was delegated to his duties during that month. This time, it was thanks to the auspices of Lieutenant General Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo. Paul Blobel was a renowned figure in the ranks of the Third Reich. An expert on this episode of Jewish extermination, Michael Okroy, sheds light on Blobel's military career, which led him to be entrusted with carrying out the operation.
Seit 1931 Mitglied der SA und dann hat
He had been a member of the SA since 1931 and rose through the ranks relatively quickly. He made a career in the SS apparatus. The Special Commando 4A, which he led, is responsible for around 60,000 murdered Jews, part of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, where people were killed on the spot.
vor Ort umgebracht worden sind.
Blobel began a phase of experimentation in the town of Chelmno, Poland, using incendiary bombs to create mass graves in the ground. However, he had to abandon this modus operandi because one of its collateral damages was the accidental burning of the nearby forests. Consequently, he investigated new and more useful procedures for what he had envisioned. He would stack layers of corpses with layers of firewood. Otherwise, he would use the rails at his disposal to arrange them as enormous grills and later crush the remaining bones in a machine built for that purpose. Father Patrick Desbois, a French Catholic priest, created an organization dedicated to locating the mass graves of Jews murdered by Nazi mobile execution units. It was called Yahad in Unum, and here he demonstrates how technical ingenuity was used for such dark purposes.
What do you do with the remains of the bones? I found these machines in Belzec with the village chief, who was employed by the Germans. The locals had to hand over the mills they used to separate barley from wheat. The Germans then replaced the grids and set them up in the extermination camp. When the Jews were dead and burned, their ashes were put in there to find all the gold teeth they still had.
His men erected pyres with wide wooden poles, doused them with flammable liquid, and placed the bodies in layers between the logs to set them alight. Once this process was completed, the area was leveled so it could be plowed and replanted. The bone fragments and ashes were reburied in the mass graves. The secret mission was called Aktion 10005, and its initial operation took place at the German extermination camp of Sobibor. This operation was also known by other terms, such as Enterdungsaktion, meaning burial action, or Sonderaktion 10005. The operation was carried out under strict confidentiality orders after the National Socialists discovered that the Allied countries were already fully aware of the regime's crimes against humanity. André Andrich, a scholar specializing in the details of Aktion 1005, points out why the name of such a macabre impunity operation remains unclear.
However, this undertaking was so secret that they did not want to come up with an associative code name for it. They simply named it after a file number within the Gestapo, the next procedure. In other words, 1005 was the 1005th case of the year 1942. That's how Operation 1005 was named.
There, prisoners reduced to servitude exhumed the deceased from the mass graves to be charred. It should be noted that the goal of this entire effort was to erase all traces of the murdered Jews, although Operation 1005 was later extended to non-Jewish prison camps. Furthermore, when the excavations were completed, the slaves involved were eliminated. This was due to the secrecy surrounding the mission, so much so that not even the German police officers involved were returned to their original detachments. Disposing of the slave prisoners, who were no longer needed, was common practice in these circumstances.
Objectified figures who were to be murdered after 2 weeks, according to protocol, because they were secret bearers. For practical reasons, the supervising perpetrators, the Gestapo, members of the security service, or ordinary policemen, then insisted on keeping their objects alive longer, because they worked relatively well. So these people were only murdered when their jobs ended. They were then the last to be forced to climb up onto these piles where the bodies were burned. And they were shot there. And they were burned together with the bodies that they had previously retrieved.
In December 1942, the procedure moved to the German city of Belzec. Later in the summers of 1942 and 1943, the deceased were cremated there. At Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. Not only that, but by June 1943, the Germans were incinerating the dead within the perimeter of the occupied Soviet Union in Poland. To this end, 2 groups of Sonderkommando inmates were formed. Some served in places like Berdichev, Ukraine, and Zamość, Poland, while others served in places like Riga and Dvinsk, Latvia. The Aktion 1005 mission reached geographical regions such as Belarus and the Baltic countries, where the bodies of Soviet soldiers were burned. The operation was also carried out in Czechoslovakia. It's important to emphasize a distinction. When newer concentration camps like Auschwitz installed crematoria to eliminate the dead, they no longer required Aktion 1005. For this reason, the mission shifted to older mass killing areas, where this technology wasn't available, such as Baby Yar and the 9th Fort. Next, we can hear the testimony of someone who experienced the torment of Aktion 1005 firsthand.
To undug all the graves, to clean out all these bodies and burn them on a fire and take out the gold from gold teeth.
Leon Wolitzker-Wells witnessed firsthand the burning of the bodies of hundreds of Jews and Polish political officials in the Ukrainian town of Lvov. They had been wiped out for trying to expose the truth about the concentration camps.
One group was the digging group. The other group was carrying the corpses to the wood. We laid out wood and burned one order of wood, and afterwards bodies. Afterwards next wood. Afterwards bodies. And afterwards, when it was high enough, about 2,000 bodies, you put on kerosene over it and you set it on fire.
A few years later, the statements of Leon Wolitzker-Wells proved extremely important for clarifying the truth of the events in their respective judicial proceedings. In mid-1944, during the onslaught of Soviet troops, it became urgent to make invisible the brutalities committed by Adolf Hitler's followers. The leader of Reichsgau Wartheland, the most important subdivision in Greater Poland, SS Major General Wilhelm Koppa, expressly ordered the 5 districts of the General Government of Poland to reenact their Aktion 1005 exercises. This was intended to clean up the mass graves in the sections of Poland that had been conquered by Nazi Germany. These measures were not completed satisfactorily, as the Russians interrupted them when advancing rapidly, or the Leichenkommando workers themselves suspended them when confronting the Germans. Such is the case of Paul Blobel's return to Bavi Yar, where he had been responsible for the deaths of around 100,000 human beings, mostly of Jewish origin. Not content with having been the perpetrator of one of the most despicable massacres of the entire war, where he had the civilian population marched into the middle of the forest to be mercilessly shot, he made sure to return there to erase every trace of that despicable event. There, Blobel gave instructions to remove the buried bodies and burn them. This did not prevent evidence of these events from being found even after the Soviet militias invaded. Blobel, who had been awarded the Iron Cross twice for his participation in the First World War, ended up being part of the Einsatzgruppen, the operational groups in charge of the massacres, at least until he was captured. When he was tried, his defense was based on arguing that his involvement was not linked to 100,000 deaths, but rather to 10,000 to 15,000. In all his statements, there was no hint of remorse. Here is the experience of someone who was able to see hell in the flesh.
They were on the other side. There was a chicken coop. They took the Jews there on foot or by car. I don't remember. Then the German officer came and told the soldiers not to let anyone through. I ran. Otherwise, they would have killed me too.
There were rare cases in which, thanks to uprisings, some were able to escape certain death. For example, at the beginning of 1943, the deportation of prisoners to Treblinka prison ceased. There, by March, the Nazis had implemented Action 1005. It was mandatory to remove any stain that might serve as evidence of the carnage that had taken place in broad daylight. The tasks were the same. The prisoners pulled the bodies from the ground to consign them to the flames, but the inmates began to suspect what would happen to them when they finished their assigned duties. The Leichenkommando commanders reached an agreement. They had decided to fight for their lives. On August 2nd, 1943, the inmates approached the arsenal stealthily to avoid detection, although they were detected. At least 300 brave souls achieved their freedom, but the Nazis returned to hunt them down, and they were caught and eliminated by the German police and forces. At a certain point, the guards regained control and ordered a cleanup of incriminating evidence. The unfortunates who remained there fulfilled their duty. They completed their duties, only to be murdered when the Nazis dispensed with their services. The Treblinka concentration camp was closed in the fall of 1943. It held a sad record. Between 870,000 and 925,000 people were exterminated within it. But this was not the only extermination site where its prisoners refused to die in vain. The inmates' ordeals fueled a yearning for rebellion that escalated and had varying results. As previously mentioned, the original implementation of Action 1005 took place in the city of Sobibor during the fall of 1942. This date coincided with the peak period of extermination maneuvers in the camp. However, the number of deportees admitted to the camp decreased in early 1943. The inmates made the bold decision to rebel against their German captors. Among themselves, They forged a resistance network and were able to organize a violent uprising. This led to a subsequent escape from the camp. On October 14, 1943, the inmates began this silent uprising. Using the weapons they had stolen during this period, the rebels were able to eliminate several guards of German and Ukrainian origin. Even so, they had to cross a minefield. As a result, only 100 of the 300 people who had left the facility survived. As a result, the Sobibor camp was closed forever. Estimates suggest that around 167,000 captives were exterminated before its closure. And Paul Blobel, the great driving force behind Action 1005, met his deserved end.
Paul Blobel sí tuvo que responder al terminar la guerra por las quemas de cadáveres, los asesinatos y los intentos de encubrirlos. El arquitecto de la muerte fue capturado mientras huía y fue juzgado en Nuremberg. Fue sentenciado a morir en la horca.
Blobel, along with others guilty of crimes against humanity, was executed on June 7, 1951. These were the last capital punishments carried out on German soil. Now, after learning how the Germans tried to cover up their gruesome crimes, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for being with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.